May 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing into silence, but it was a silence thick with ruin, exhaustion, and the remnants of unimaginable noise. After 6 years of total conflict that reshaped the world and consumed tens of millions of lives, the guns had finally stopped. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hitler was dead in the ruins of Berlin, and the Third Reich, once envisioned as an empire destined to last 1,000 years, had lasted barely 12. Cities across Germany were piles of broken brick and twisted steel, burned-out shells rising like tombstones above chasms where streets once ran. Roads were cratered by bombing. Bridges lay collapsed like broken ribs over rivers swollen with spring melt and debris of war. In that landscape of devastation, with smoke still drifting from shattered industrial districts and the smell of cordite embedded into the soil, the Allies began the process of occupying a country that had fought to the last breath. Everywhere they advanced, American, British, French, and Soviet soldiers saw scenes that felt unreal. Highways clogged with prisoners and refugees, shattered villages where houses stood with walls stripped open like anatomical diagrams, families searching for missing relatives, soldiers wandering aimlessly without commanders, and roads littered with abandoned equipment, uniforms, documents, and machines left where they fell. The war was over, but the work ahead loomed enormous. There were weapons to secure, surviving Nazi officials to capture, secret research facilities to locate, and mountains of intelligence locked away in bunkers, depots, and factories that had not yet been discovered. Nothing symbolized the magnitude of that task more clearly than what remained of Hitler's most feared armored weapon, the Tiger tank. Across Europe, hundreds of Tiger I and Tiger II tanks, once the kings of the battlefield, now sat silent. Some were abandoned on roadsides, their engines cold, tracks frozen in mud where the last desperate attempt to retreat had failed. Others lay burned out in hedgerows, fields, and forests, their turrets blown open by internal demolition charges or artillery strikes. Some remained intact inside repair depots, quietly waiting for crews who would never return. Others were found on railway sidings, positioned for shipment that never came, covered by tarps that flapped weakly in spring wind. They looked like prehistoric beasts trapped in ice, frozen in their final moments, surrounded by the ruins of a country they had once defended with brutal effectiveness. For Allied troops who walked past them, the feeling was almost supernatural. The war's most terrifying machine, suddenly powerless. Since their battlefield debut in 1942, the Tiger tanks had earned a reputation unmatched by any armored vehicle of the war. Allied crews spoke of them with a mixture of dread and respect that bordered on mythology. Sherman tanks burned in front of them like paper. British Churchills and Cromwells crumpled under the shock of their 88mm guns. Soviet T-34 crews faced them in battles where one Tiger could destroy dozens before being overwhelmed. Even the silhouette of the Tiger created fear, tall, broad, and with slab-like armor that seemed to deflect everything thrown at it. When Allied tankers spotted the boxy turret and the long cannon protruding like the stinger of an iron wasp, they felt the same chill every time. We are already too close. Now, with Germany surrendered, the Allies found themselves in possession of the machines they had feared most. What followed was not merely battlefield cleanup, it was a race. A new kind of battle had begun, the war for intelligence. By May 8, 1945, when surrender officially took effect, approximately 1,800 Tiger tanks had been manufactured, including both the Tiger I and a heavier, more advanced Tiger II. The majority had already been destroyed in combat, knocked out during battles in North Africa, Italy, Normandy, the Ardennes, Kursk, and countless lesser engagements. But several hundred still survived in various conditions. Some were functional, others were damaged but reparable. Some were abandoned intact simply because they ran out of fuel. In the chaotic final weeks of the war, as German infrastructure collapsed and supply lines vanished beneath constant Allied bombing and Soviet breakthroughs, keeping a Tiger running had become nearly impossible. The tank that was once unstoppable on the battlefield had been defeated not by enemy guns, but by mathematics, by fuel consumption, mechanical strain, engineering complexity, and a logistical burden too heavy even for Germany's massive war machine to bear. As American and British forces moved into Bavaria, Hesse, and Baden-Württemberg, they encountered Tigers in German depots where maintenance crews had fled, leaving engines half disassembled and tools still lying on workbenches. At the Henschel factory complex in Kassel, where Tiger II production had been concentrated. American units discovered hulls awaiting assembly, production jigs frozen mid-process, and crates filled with precision-machined turret components that would never be used. In northern Germany, British units pushing toward Denmark and Hamburg encountered abandoned heavy tank battalions whose crews had surrendered or deserted. Some tanks were lined up in formation as if waiting for inspection. Others sat alone on forest roads where their final defensive stand had failed. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces advancing through Silesia and Czechoslovakia captured entire training facilities with Tigers preserved in near-perfect condition, vehicles that had never seen combat, but now stood ready for testing. The conditions varied wildly. Some Tigers appeared pristine, untouched by battle, their armor surfaces still bearing factory machining marks beneath dust. Others were violently destroyed, their turrets scattered like giant steel crowns blown 50 feet away by explosive charges placed inside by their own crews. Many carried deep scars from anti-tank rifles, AP rounds, shaped charges, and artillery fragments. Dents, burns, cracked weld seams, and jagged penetration holes visible like autopsy wounds across their hulls. Engineers, mechanics, and intelligence officers walked among them, studying damage patterns like forensic examiners reading the final minutes of mechanical death. The Tiger's weight alone presented an immediate challenge. At more than 54 tons for the Tiger I and nearly 70 for the Tiger II, moving them required heavy transport equipment, rail cars designed for extreme loads, or specialized American and British recovery vehicles. Roads destroyed by bombing made relocation nearly impossible in some regions. Even when tanks were undamaged, simply starting them was often impossible. Batteries were dead, wiring had been stripped, or fuel systems contaminated with water or dust. Many Tigers contained missing parts, deliberately removed by German crews determined to prevent capture. Within Allied command, a fierce debate developed. The Tiger was both a physical object and a symbol, the embodiment of Nazi armored strength. Some military leaders argued they should be destroyed immediately, eliminated like the Reich they served. Others insisted they represented unprecedented intelligence value. Understanding the Tiger's armor composition, suspension design, optical systems, internal layout, and especially the 88mm gun could significantly influence future armor doctrine. No other tank had altered battlefield psychology as significantly. No other vehicle had forced enemies to redesign tactics around its existence. Destroying the Tiger without studying it, some argued, would be a mistake equal to leaving gold in the dirt. American tank crews had fought the Tiger across 3 continents: North Africa, Italy, and France. They had felt the shock of its cannon and had watched Sherman's ignite in seconds. The United States Army's Ordnance Department wasted no time. Intelligence teams spread across German territory, tagging intact examples for shipment to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. There, engineers prepared test ranges and firing lanes dedicated to examining German armor. Aberdeen already possessed a Tiger I from the Tunisian campaign, captured in 1943, but now multiple additional vehicles were inbound. As soon as they arrived, American engineers began ballistic testing, firing 75mm, 76mm, 90mm, and specialized experimental rounds at Tiger armor plates positioned at multiple angles. They measured spalling, cracking patterns, deflection, and internal fragmentation. They chemically analyzed armor samples to understand German alloy composition and heat treatment processes. The tests confirmed the battlefield truth. The Tiger's frontal armor was nearly impossible to penetrate with the standard Sherman 75mm gun, except at dangerously close range. Even the improved 76mm gun struggled. Only the American 90mm, mounted on late-war tanks, such as the M26 Pershing or tank destroyers like the M36, could confidently engage Tigers frontally. And even then, shot placement and terrain dictated survival. British testing followed a similar pattern. Engineers and tank experts dismantled engines, transmissions, and suspension assemblies to understand the internal structure. The interleaved road wheels, a hallmark of German design, fascinated British mechanics who admired the smooth ride quality they provided, but also documented the severe maintenance problems they caused in muddy, icy, or frozen conditions. Drivers who tested operational Tigers at Bovington reported surprising maneuverability despite their size, praising the steering system and turret traverse rate. Gunners praised the German optics, Zeiss and Late scopes that provided precision unmatched by Allied equipment. At the same time, British engineers noted reliability problems, high breakdown rates, extreme fuel needs, and repair procedures that required specialized workshops rather than battlefield expediency. Tigers were terrifying in combat, but they were fragile within the larger war economy. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union pursued its own evaluation, having faced more Tigers than anyone else at Kursk in Ukraine, in Poland, and in the final drive toward Berlin. Soviet forces captured dozens in multiple conditions and transported intact examples to Kubinka, near Moscow. There, Soviet technicians conducted brutally direct tests. They fired 85mm, 100mm, and 122mm guns at Tiger armor to analyze penetration capability and tactical engagement distances. They evaluated internal crew layout, ammunition storage safety, and mechanical failure points. Stalin himself requested updates on heavy tank research, and lessons learned from the Tiger influenced Soviet post-war designs, including the IS-3 and subsequent heavy tanks that would shape the early Cold War. Competition soon emerged among the Allies for the rarest specimens, particularly late-model Tiger IIs, featuring modifications made during the final year of production. Allied occupation forces discovered prototypes, experimental vehicles, and uncompleted hulls in factories and castle storage sites. Each example represented a strategic asset. Each example became a prize, and the collection of these captured vehicles subtly signaled the ideological divide that would soon split the victorious alliance. By late 1945, dozens of Tigers had been tested, dissected, and documented in thousands of pages of engineering reports. Their secrets were no longer secrets, and now a new reality loomed. The vast majority of surviving Tigers would not be preserved. They were too heavy, too complex, too expensive, too impractical, and too dangerous to maintain. Their future was not glory, not ceremony, not preservation. Their future was destruction. When the guns finally fell silent and the last fortified lines of the Reich dissolved into surrender, the Allies faced a monumental task that stretched far beyond celebration and occupation. A sprawling continent lay shattered, infrastructure broken, and a defeated military machine stood in ruins of its own making. Among the wreckage, the Tiger tank emerged not merely as a battlefield trophy, but as a logistical and political dilemma. Every surviving Tiger represented a massive piece of machinery weighing upwards of 50 to 70 tons, requiring equipment and manpower simply to move it off the ground where it rested. The first problem confronting the Allies was not what the Tigers had once done in battle. They already knew that too well, but what to do with them now? They could not be left to rot in place, leaking fuel, blocking roads, and symbolizing the armored might of a defeated government whose ideology the world had sworn never to rise again. Nor could they remain intact, available for any resurgent faction, black market group, or extremist remnant hoping to revive war. They were dangerous simply by existing. The Tiger was never a practical machine after the war, not in an economy turned to rebuilding from rubble. It required enormous quantities of oil, specialized parts, machine tools, and trained mechanics. Its engineering complexity, once a point of pride for German designers, was now a curse. Even when undamaged, a Tiger's engine could burn hundreds of liters of fuel in a single day of movement, a luxury not even occupying armies were willing to indulge when displaced civilians starved and factories lay without electricity. Steel, copper, and rubber were now far more valuable than military pride. Europe needed bridges, railways, homes, and heating, not hulking armored monuments scattered across farmland and forests. So decisions were made with cold efficiency. The Tigers would be eliminated, disposed of as scrap metal, target practice, propaganda exhibit, or museum artifact. Their legacy would remain, but the machines themselves would not. By late 1945, the Allied Control Council issued orders that Germany could not retain any armored fighting vehicles of any type. The message was unambiguous. No tanks, no armored cars, no self-propelled guns, no capacity to rebuild an army. Demilitarization was total. Among the first to be targeted for destruction were the remaining Tigers, which represented not only the technological peak of German armor, but also the symbolic peak of German resistance. The majority of surviving Tigers scattered across Germany were gathered into disposal sites, often former Wehrmacht training grounds or Allied collection yards. Engineers and demolition crews were assigned to render them permanently unusable. Some tanks were disabled by explosives, turrets blown off in controlled detonations that echoed across landscapes already familiar with thunder. Others had their guns cut apart with industrial torches, breech blocks removed, engines smashed, transmissions torn open, tracks severed like broken chains. Many became targets for gunnery training, allowing Allied crews to test the penetration capability of modern anti-tank rounds and learn to defeat the armor that had once terrorized them in battle. At these firing demonstrations, soldiers watched shells slam into heavy armor that had once resisted nearly everything thrown at it. The spectacle was more than practical training. It was catharsis, a ritual destruction of a weapon that had taken countless Allied lives. In northern Germany, at Bergen-Hohn, British forces assembled a vast collection of captured German armor destined for elimination. Panthers, Jagdpanthers, Sturmgeschütz assault guns, self-propelled artillery pieces, and Tigers stood lined up in rows stretching across clearing fields. Engineers studied the most efficient methods to disable them, sometimes by dismantling internal components, sometimes by using explosives to tear open the hull like a steel fruit split apart. The turrets of some Tigers were blasted free from their mounts, thrown aside like discarded helmets. Soldiers remembered the earth shaking with each controlled detonation, fireworks of flaming metal rising above the treeline. The destruction created dramatic scenes, steel fragments flying, armored plates folding under concussive blasts, but it ensured finality. Some tanks were later loaded onto rail cars, cut into pieces, and sent to steel mills where their once feared armor was melted into ingots destined not for battlefield use, but for bridges, ship hulls, tools, vehicles, farm equipment, and reconstruction materials. In a twist of irony, the machine built to dominate Europe now helped rebuild it. The landscape of Normandy still bore the scars of 1944, and many Tigers remained where they had fallen during the battles following D-Day. Wrecks lay half-buried in hedgerows, rusting in orchards, in drainage ditches beside roads littered with twisted metal from the summer that had changed history. Some Tigers were simply too damaged to move or too remote to justify recovery. Local authorities bulldozed them into pits, buried them beneath fields, or dragged them to scrap yards where they were dismantled for metal. In villages across France, children grew up playing on burned-out tanker hulls until the machines were removed in the 1950s to clear space for reconstruction. Some wrecks were pulled from battlefields and placed as memorials before ultimately being removed when maintenance became untenable. A few remnants still linger in private land, discovered decades later by metal detectors or construction crews who stumbled upon rusted armor like buried treasure. The French army briefly considered retaining captured Tigers for their own armored forces. In a country that had lost most of its heavy industry and desperately needed equipment, the idea seemed appealing. However, the reality became quickly apparent. Maintaining the Tiger required a logistical network that no longer existed. There were no parts, no trained crews, and no fuel to waste on temperamental beasts that broke down after a few hours of operation. French tank schools used a small number of captured Tigers for instruction and analysis, but by the early 1950s, even those were retired due to mechanical collapse and stripped for components. Only a few made their way into museums. The Soviets took a different approach. While they destroyed many Tigers across their occupation zones, they also recognized the propaganda value of displaying the formerly invincible German machines to the public. Dozens were transported to museums across the Soviet Union, including Kubinka outside Moscow, where some were restored to operational condition for demonstrations or military parades. Filmmakers used Tigers, often repaired with improvised Soviet parts, as props in war films that dramatized Soviet victories. Unlike their Western counterparts, Soviet engineers benefited from access to multiple complete examples, allowing them to study production variations and long-term durability. Some Tigers captured in Eastern Europe sat in depots for decades, occasionally brought out for ceremonial display, though more commonly left in storage yards exposed to weather. Economic reality drove much of the destruction. Europe faced extreme shortages of steel, copper, and other industrial materials. Thousands of tons of metal locked inside abandoned German armor represented a crucial resource. Scrapping a single Tiger could yield enough high-grade steel to produce significant quantities of industrial equipment needed for rebuilding transportation networks, rail tracks, tools, and machinery. For communities where unemployment soared and famine threatened, scrap salvage became a livelihood. Civilian contractors, some former soldiers, traveled from village to village cutting apart abandoned armor for profit. Sparks lit up the night sky as torches bit into dense steel that once deflected shells and bombs. The Tiger was reduced to rubble by the same hands that had once feared it. Its armor melted and reborn into peacetime infrastructure. There was irony in that transformation, but also necessity. Environmental concerns also played a role. Many Tigers abandoned in forests or riverbanks leaked oil, fuel, and lead-based lubricants into soil and waterways. Farmers complained of poisoned fields. Local governments wanted the hulks removed. Land cleared for farming could not be plowed with tanks lodged beneath the surface. Rivers needed dredging. The war machines had to disappear, not remain as monuments to destruction. In some cases, Tigers that had plunged into lakes during panicked retreats remained underwater, too costly to recover until decades later when divers rediscovered them, half consumed by sediment. Some of these submerged wrecks would later emerge as legendary restorations. But in the immediate aftermath, they were simply forgotten, too difficult and too expensive to salvage when hunger and cold mattered more. By 1948, less than 3 years after the war ended, almost all of the remaining Tigers had vanished. Battlefield wrecks were buried or cut apart. Scrap operations devoured hundreds. Those used in firing tests were left riddled with holes and eventually scrapped. The few that remained intact were concentrated in museums, proving grounds, and military schools. The speed and thoroughness of Tiger elimination reflected not only Allied determination to dismantle German war potential, but also a generational transition. The world was moving toward new military doctrines dominated by faster, more mobile armored vehicles and soon, guided weapons and nuclear strategy. The Tiger, a slow and resource-hungry machine designed for industrial war of the early 1940s, had no place in the weapons architecture of the atomic age. No country attempted to field Tigers operationally after the war. They were too expensive, too rare, too complex, and ultimately too obsolete as technology evolved at incredible speed in the late 1940s and early Cold War. While aircraft like the Bf-109 and Ju-52 saw limited post-war service, no army wanted the burden of the Tiger. It was an icon of a vanished era. Some were offered to countries for evaluation, but almost all were rejected or scrapped. Yet even as the physical machines were destroyed, the legend of the Tiger began to grow. Historians, engineers, filmmakers, and veterans created demand for preservation. By the 1960s, military museums recognized how few remained. Restoration efforts began, though they were costly and time-consuming. Some Tigers were recovered from marshes in Poland, forests in Russia, or scrapyards in Germany. Many were incomplete, missing turrets or engines, but even wreckage held value. Museums invested years in reconstruction. Private collectors searched for fragments. Enthusiasts traded rare parts like relics. The myth intensified precisely because the machines themselves were nearly gone. The fewer Tigers remained, the larger they became in memory. When restoration specialists at Bovington began returning their Tiger to running condition, the process took decades, requiring original components sourced from around the world. Today, Tiger 131 remains the only operational Tiger on the planet, an irreplaceable artifact whose engine roars like thunder when it moves, drawing thousands of visitors every time it is started. Other surviving Tigers sit housed across museums in Russia, France, Poland, Britain, Germany, and the United States, representing less than 1% of all Tigers built. What followed the war was not gentle preservation. It was erasure. What survived was an accident of geography, timing, and luck. And the road that led to preservation was carved through fire, demolition, and decades of neglect. The Tiger did not disappear quietly. It vanished violently, piece by piece, until only fragments remained. As the immediate post-war years passed, the Tiger tank transitioned from a physical reality scattered across fields and depots into a relic of a vanished world. The machines that had once defined the terror and brutality of armored warfare were reduced to fragments and memories. In towns, forests, and scrapyards, the steel remains of Tigers rusted away under rain and sun until little trace remained of the armored colossus that once dominated entire battlefields. For most people living in post-war Europe, the Tiger was not a legendary machine. It was a problem to be cleared from farmland, a dangerous hulk leaking oil, a relic unwanted in a world desperate to move forward. But for soldiers who had faced them in battle, engineers who studied them, and historians who tried to understand them, the tiger became something else. A symbol of the extremes of human invention, a paradox of brilliance and waste, and a reminder of the devastating cost of war. In the decade after the war ended, a tiny handful of tigers survived the global purge. These survivors lived strange lives, far removed from the machines that once charged through the smoke of Kursk or rumbled through the hedgerows of Normandy. France retained a small number, primarily for research and instruction. One tiger was used at the French tank school in Saumur, where instructors examined German engineering and demonstrated the power of the 88mm gun to new generations of officers. The tank sat on the proving field, its original German markings scraped away, driven occasionally for demonstrations, a mechanical fossil in a world quickly moving toward lighter, faster, post-war vehicles. French engineers attempted to keep it operational, but shortages of spare parts and the complexity of maintenance eventually forced them to retire it. The vehicle was rolled into storage, preserved by chance rather than intention. Today it resides as a museum artifact, protected under controlled light and temperature. Its restoration, a chapter written long after war had ended. Britain, too, retained several tigers. The example at Bovington, captured in Tunisia, became the most famous of all. It was studied extensively in the years following the war, disassembled and reassembled repeatedly, its engine evaluated, its optics inspected, its armor measured, its mobility tested. It was used to train tank engineers and to instruct new generations of armored officers on how to fight heavy tanks. When its educational service ended, it was transferred to the Tank Museum at Bovington, preserved indoors as an irreplaceable historical artifact. For decades it sat immobile and silent, admired by visitors but frozen in time. It was not until the 1990s that restoration specialists undertook the monumental task of returning it to running condition, a multi-year effort requiring original parts from multiple countries, tailor-made components when originals could not be found, and precise mechanical tolerances that challenged engineers even with modern tools. When its engine finally roared again, the ground shook, and thousands of spectators watched a machine thought lost to time come back to life. It remains today the only operational Tiger I in the world, and its engine is run sparingly, as each minute of operation risks an irreplaceable failure. The Soviet Union possessed the largest number of surviving Tigers after the war, scattered across museums from Moscow to Prague to Warsaw. Many of these vehicles bore scars from combat or improper storage, corroded armor, shattered welds, missing internal components. But they offered the widest range of production examples, including early Tiger I models, late war variants, and several Tiger II hulls and turrets. Engineers and historians studied them throughout the Cold War, examining armor configurations, suspension updates, and mechanical modifications applied during the final stages of German production. Soviet institutions used these vehicles for propaganda display, placing captured Tigers beside destroyed German airplanes and artillery as symbolic proof of victory. Visitors walked past them without understanding how close they came to extinction. In some places, they sat outside for decades, snow collecting on their turrets, children climbing over them as playground objects, rain eating into their steel until the vehicles seemed more like ancient ruins than modern technology. Across Europe, a few Tigers survived by accident of geography. In Belgium, a Tiger II abandoned during the Battle of the Bulge remained in the village of La Gleize, too heavy to move and too iconic to destroy. It sat rusting in the open air until local authorities declared a memorial. Its imposing silhouette became part of the village identity. In Poland and Russia, wrecks were pulled from rivers and marshes, recovered in dramatic salvage operations decades after they had disappeared beneath mud and water. Some were so badly damaged that restoration was impossible, but even fragments held immense historical value. Steel plates bearing penetration craters, shattered engines, burned-out turrets, all became specimens in a long scientific autopsy of German engineering. The process of restoration became its own specialized field, requiring historians, metalworkers, archivists, photographers, and mechanical experts to reconstruct machines that no factory would ever again produce. By the 1960s and 1970s, interest in preserving Tigers began to grow rapidly. The rise of military history publishing, the increasing prominence of war films and documentaries, and the emergence of enthusiasts who dedicated their lives to studying World War II machinery all contributed to the Tiger's transformation from forgotten scrap to revered artifact. People who had grown up hearing veterans speak about facing tigers and young engineers fascinated by complex mechanisms began searching for surviving examples. Recovery expeditions scoured forests, swamps, and abandoned military grounds. News of a found tiger spread globally, generating excitement comparable to archaeological discoveries. Museums competed for ownership, private collectors sought parts at extraordinary prices, and governments participated in negotiations for legal transfers. For vehicles once destined for total destruction, this was an unthinkable rebirth. The scarcity of surviving tigers created a powerful historical gravity. They became not just machines, but symbols, still witnesses to a nightmare era, artifacts that spoke louder than testimony. Each surviving tiger became an irreplaceable resource, a physical archive of a war that reshaped the world. Historians and engineers measured armor angles, welding patterns, optical quality, turret rotation speeds, and manufacturing differences from one production batch to another. Photographers created detailed records. Digital modeling captured internal systems in extraordinary detail. For veterans, standing beside a tiger brought back memories of battles that remained etched into their bones and their nightmares. For younger generations, the machines made history tangible. At the same time, the tiger gained an extraordinary afterlife in culture. Books, documentaries, and films amplified its legend. The tiger became synonymous with unstoppable power, battlefield dominance, and engineering brilliance. Model kit companies mass-produced scale replicas. Game developers featured tigers at the center of virtual armored warfare. The machine that was nearly erased became immortal. But the legend often obscured reality. The tiger was not a perfect machine. It was slow, mechanically fragile, and prone to breakdowns. It demanded massive logistical support and consumed fuel at disastrous rates. It was too expensive to mass produce and too heavy for many bridges and roads. Its greatest strength was psychological, and its battlefield impact was shaped less by quantity than by fear. In truth, the tiger's legacy is contradictory. It was brilliant and flawed, devastating and impractical, terrifying and self-defeating. It changed the course of tank warfare not by winning the war, but by forcing its enemies to evolve. Its destruction after the war was not erasure, it was transformation. For more than 1,100 built, only a handful survive. They sit today in museums across 6 nations, each representing not a machine, but an entire era. They draw thousands of visitors who walk slowly around their steel hulls, trying to imagine the noise of the engine, the heat of the interior, the fear of meeting one in battle. Veterans who fought against tigers rarely stood beside them without emotion. Some touched the armor with reverence, others with rage, some with silent grief for friends lost to a machine that no longer roared. The stories embedded in steel became heavier than the armor itself. Modern efforts to locate missing tigers continue. Occasionally, a wreck is discovered in a forest or pulled from a riverbed, sparking global excitement. Each discovery is treated like a time capsule. Journalists arrive, camera crews film the recovery, museum teams prepare proposals, engineers begin restoration planning, and historians examine serial numbers to trace the tank's service history. Sometimes the vehicle is too damaged to salvage, but even fragments return to museums as pieces of a puzzle nearly lost. Every find reminds the world how quickly machines, once unstoppable, can vanish. Every rediscovery reinforces how fragile history becomes when left to rust. Today, a small number of complete tigers remain, scattered across the world. In Bovington, in Kubinka, in Saumur, in Fort Benning, in Vimetiers, in Munster, in Loglise, and in a few other guarded places. They sit silent, engines dormant, paint faded, tracks frozen in time. They do not move through smoke and fire anymore. They do not dominate battlefields. They do not announce themselves with the thunder of their 88mm guns. They exist now as monuments, not to victory or defeat, not to technology or power, but to memory. People walk around them slowly, not quickly. They read plaques, watch the light reflect off the armor, listen to guides explain manufacturing details or battle history. They stand quietly, trying to comprehend what it meant to face such a machine in war. Many visitors leave saying they expected the tanks to be larger, or perhaps smaller. But nearly all leave feeling something heavy, a sense of time, of loss, of mortality. The Tiger tank's survival story is not about triumph. It is about disappearance and rediscovery, destruction and remembrance. It is about how a machine that once symbolized conquest became an artifact of warning. It is about how quickly the most formidable technologies can become obsolete. It is about the humility that comes after catastrophic ambition. And it is about the way memory reshapes the past into something that future generations must confront. The machines themselves may be cold and silent, but the echoes they carry are not. They speak through steel and scars, reminding us that war devours everything: lives, cities, nations, and even its own most powerful weapons. When visitors stand before a surviving Tiger today, they're not looking at a weapon of war. They're looking at a monument carved from the consequences of war. They're looking at a machine that once changed the world and then nearly disappeared from it entirely. They are looking at the physical remains of a myth, stripped of its engine of violence, preserved only so its story cannot slip away into dust. There will never be more of them. There will only be fewer. And maybe that scarcity is what gives the Tiger its final meaning. Power fades, steel rusts, and time erases even giants. What happened to the German Tiger tanks after World War II was not a single event, but a sweeping transformation. They were hunted, captured, tested, dismantled, destroyed, buried, scrapped, forgotten, rediscovered, restored, and finally placed behind barriers of glass and silence. They became ghosts that refused to vanish, artifacts that insisted on being remembered. The Tiger's legacy survives not in how many were built or how many were destroyed, but in the weight carried by the few that remain, a weight heavier than steel. Today, those machines stand motionless, engines cold, cannons silent, paint cracked by decades of weather and time. But they remain, and their presence reminds the world of a war that reshaped civilization and of a weapon that embodied both the pinnacle of engineering and the abyss of destruction. They are not relics of glory. They are relics of warning. And as long as they stand, they ensure that the lessons written in fire and steel are not forgotten.